All right, everyone, we'll go ahead and get started here, I think. Welcome. Just a few housekeeping items here. My name is Alex Niedermeyer, and I work for Tetra Tech, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. So in case you're not super familiar with Zoom, a couple of things. All participants are automatically muted when they come in. So please don't worry that your mute might be off if you're an attendee. Your view, you do have some ability to change your view from a panel view so that you can see all the speakers at one time or only see the active speaker. As you are muted, we still encourage you to interact with our panelists today. You have two ways to do that. One is the Q&A button. So if you have a specific question based on the presentations that you'd like to share with the presenter, please do use the Q&A button. Then we can answer you via a text message in real time during the presentation. And then we'll have a good record of those at the end. And then finally, the chat feature. Some of you are already using that, which is great. Please feel free to introduce yourself through the chat. And be sure that when you are sending the chat, you choose using that little drop-down menu in the message area that you choose who you want to send it to. So you can either send it to all the panelists, so myself and the other speakers today, or to everybody that's attending the conference. And then finally, also a reminder to please do be careful given the pandemic and COVID-19, and ensure that if you are in a public space participating or just joining us for the conference, that you do wear a mask and follow all other guidelines to protect yourself from COVID-19. So with that, I will hand it over to Patricia and let her get started. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Alex. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome once again to our session on the Integrated Land and Resource Governance Annual Research Symposium. We're very grateful to USAID and the ILRG project for hosting this seminar, and we're looking forward to some great presentations and discussions. My name is Patricia Mpetamuyamwa. I am with the Nature Conservancy. I lead our work in Africa on indigenous landscapes and natural resources in East and Southern Africa. I will be your moderator for today. I am Zambian, and so I'm very versed in the issues of natural resource management in Zambia, and I'm happy to chair this session. We have 5 presentations for today, and what we'll do is I'll introduce the speaker at the beginning of each presentation. They have 15 minutes to present their main findings and some overviews of their area of research. And then what we'll do that for all the 5 presentations, and then we'll have a rich Q&A at the end after an hour. So what I would like to ask is, if folks have a specific question for a presenter, please take note of it, and then we will have a moderated session of questions. So I'd like to introduce our first presenter today. I don't know if, just want to double check if Grant, you're able to, are you able to, is your mic working now? Sorry, he was having a bit of a challenge. If not, I'm going to introduce Ms. Sozi. All right, we'll do a bit of a reverse. So let me start by introducing our first presenter. Madam Msozi Ngulube is going to present a paper on wildlife management in Zambia, policy and legal interventions for sustainable development. Msozi is an advocate of the High Court of Zambia. She possesses in excess of 8 years experience from both private and public sectors in prominent legal positions, and has participated in a World Bank project on the review of the Zambezi River Act Authority. She worked at the Zambia Wildlife Authority as a legal officer and a legal counsel board secretary. When Zambia was transformed to the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, Masozi served as the Assistant Director, Legal Affairs, being the head of the legal section of the institution. In January 2020, she was transferred to the Cabinet Office under Management Development Division under the Decentralization Secretariat as Assistant Director for Legal and Regulatory Reforms, where she coordinates decentralization reforms. I will now hand over to Ms. Ozi. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing about your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will just go right into my presentation in view of time and limiting factors. My presentation is entitled Wildlife Management in Zambia, Policy and Legal Interventions for Sustainable Development. Yes, so by way of introduction and background, currently the Wildlife Administration in Zambia is governed by the National Parks and Wildlife Policy of 2018 and the Zambia Wildlife Act number 14 of 2015. And previously, there was the Zambia Wildlife Act of 1998 and the policy that was passed in 1997. Wildlife administration dates as far back as colonialism. However, it has got both challenges with the provisions of the law and enforcement challenges. So in my study, I was trying to identify the current enforcement and legal provision challenges and suggest interventions for sustainable development. So I have singled out, we can proceed to the next slide. Yes. So I have identified these challenges in themes. I'll start with law enforcement challenges. My study noted that currently the Wildlife Act provides for both illegal possession and illegal trafficking, but it does not differentiate between or categorize the differences. So in terms of enforcement, even if the law recognizes that there's illegal trafficking, most offenses are tried as illegal possession, even if their magnitude is higher. Therefore, at the conclusion of my presentation, I'll suggest policy and legal interventions. Let me not jump the gun. Then the other enforcement challenge relates to the IUCN ranger density. Currently, the recommendation is 50 square kilometers per ranger. However, from the statistics that were obtained from the Zambia Wildlife Authority at the time this study was undertaken, at the time, the ranger density ratio was 278 square kilometers per ranger, which presents a challenge as far as law enforcement is concerned, because the higher the ranger density ratio, the more chances of having areas that are not properly patrolled or managed. Another issue identified was a lack of state-of-the-art equipment for detection of wildlife. And an example was sometime in 2018, there was a case in which wildlife was trafficked from Zambia and it was intercepted in South Africa. So it suggested that it's either we don't have state-of-the-art equipment or there could have been more reasons why the detection did not happen. We could proceed to the next slide. As far as another theme I identified in my study is financing and sustainable financing and tourism in protected areas. The first challenge was low investment of infrastructure by the government in protected areas, which leads to low intake of investment because investors are avoiding areas where it's more expensive to invest. Another issue I identified is lack of diversification of tourism products. In my interviews conducted, most tourism facilities or enterprises concentrated on international tourists and what is called low volume, high value tourism. But there's need for diversification. Another challenge was low contribution of tourism to the gross domestic product. And finally, the lack of sector-specific incentives. The study identified that right now, what operators investing in tourism have to rely on are the ones provided for by the Zambia Development Act, number 11 of 2006. But because of the nature of investment in protected areas, this is not incentive enough because most of the undertakings are reduced in size. So there's need for more sector-specific incentives, but I'll give more details on this. And then on local community participation, what the study identified is, first of all, our legislation does not provide local communities the right to utilize wildlife, although it recognizes the importance of local communities in management of wildlife. And then also, most of the areas where local communities manage or participate in the management is under customary land tenure, which is currently more or less unsecured. So even where local communities want to engage in partnerships, they'll be asked, oh, do you have title deeds? If they want to engage in financing, the formalization of the land tenure is not there, which is a problem. Another problem that was identified is issues of capacity and managerial skills. And in this, we mean if we want to allow local communities to enter into partnerships, even just the process of negotiating a contract, we want to make sure they negotiate terms and conditions that are beneficial to them. Therefore, there's need to build capacity. And also, the last issue was financial sustainability in relation to community management of wildlife. So most of the revenue is expected from a share of hunting fees or a share of community pledges under tourism concessions. But if there's no hunting, so for those areas where there's no hunting, there's lack of sustainability. You find community scouts remain unpaid, and this continues to be a challenge. We can proceed to the next slide. So the possible interventions to address the highlighted challenges is to, first of all, ensure that the law is revised to differentiate illegal possession from illegal trafficking. And there's need to be very specific because the previous Wildlife Act had referred to the legislation on drugs and narcotic substances, but it's not sufficient because the two are different. Therefore, you can't use the quantities in narcotic and psychotropic substances to relate to the quantities with illegal possession. So it's something that needs to be given a lot of thought. We also need to ensure that state-of-the-art equipment is placed at strategic points such as airports. And finally, on law enforcement, work at reducing the ranger density ratio from the current situation. Then finally, I'm looking at time. The last, yes. So also there's need to increase investment in infrastructure, especially by government as the key stakeholders, so that it can attract investors, as opposed to waiting for the investors to put the infrastructure itself. And also the other recommendation is diversification of tourism products, especially in view of what has happened with the COVID situation. We're not having a lot of international tourists, so the tourism sector has been highly impacted. But if we could build on domestic tourism, that will help. Provide sector-specific incentives, and also this we could work with Zambia Development Agency so that the sector-specific incentives are recognized and are tailored to meet this particular sector. There's also need to grant wildlife user rights to local communities and build capacity as well, so that the rights go along with the capacity, as opposed to the current situation where there are trust issues of whether if rights are given to local communities, will they be able to enjoy them and ensure that they benefit from the same? In view of the time, I think this is my last substantive slide. I hope I'm within the 15 minutes.
Yes, you are. And you actually left some extra time. Thank you so much, Ms. Ozzy. Thanks for keeping to time. And yeah, I hope folks have kept a note of their questions. And we will have a session where we can ask some follow-ups after this. I'd like to introduce the next speaker. Dr. Dina Mambwe-Kaingu is a lecturer in the School of Natural Resources at the Copperbelt University. Her background is in agronomy, but she's currently studying her PhD in public and development management studies. She's interested in land use in protected areas, which is marred with competing uses. Her presentation is on human migration and settlements in protected areas, a case study of Mumbwa Game Management Area. Welcome, Dina, and I'll hand over to you. Thank
Good afternoon and good morning, participants. I'm presenting on human migration and settlement trends in protected areas, and I'm using Mumbwa GMA as a case study. Next, please. So just as an introduction, game management areas are a form of protected area which serve as buffers to national parks. And like any other protected areas, GMAs in Zambia have been marred with a lot of people migrating there for several reasons, among them being they're looking for farmland, or it could be that they're attracted to some amenities or services that are offered by the GMA, or that they could actually be just refugees seeking some form of solace from the GMA. So my interest is in Mumbwa Game Management Area, which is one of the buffers to the Kafue National Park. This work was part of my PhD, and whose overall aim was to contribute towards improved land use in Mumbwa GMA. As a specific objective, I wanted to investigate the magnitude and the patterns of human migrations in Mumbwa GMA. So the way the land is used in the GMA is that it's divided into 5 zones, which each have a specific use. I was interested in 2 zones, the conservation and the development zone. The conservation zone, which is the largest, and it occupies 57% of the GMA, is primarily used to conserve wildlife. So meaning in the conservation zone, people are not allowed to settle, but they're allowed to settle in the development zone, which occupies about 16% of the GMA. So in my study, I was contrasting these 2 GMAs. Next slide, please. So I'll present some of the findings. It should be noted that the GMA is traditionally under 3 chiefs. We have Chief Chibuluma and Chief Mlendema, who are chiefs to Ila people. Then there's also Chief Kabulebule, who's chief to the Nkoya people. So what we'd expect in the GMA is that we would have more Ilas and more Nkoyas. But as you can see from the first pie chart, in the conservation zone, we have 77.3% of people of Tongas who are originally from the southern part of the country. So these are not native to the development zone, sorry, the GMA. This is alarming because they are slowly taking over their numbers are getting high, and they're slowly taking over the GMA. If you look at the pie chart, which is at the bottom, you find that there at least there's more diversity. We still have quite a substantial amount of the Ila as well as the Nkoya people who are native to the GMA. Next slide, please. So one of the things I was interested in was to look at how long the households had stayed in their respective zones. As you can see from the table, those living in the conservation zone had stayed for an average of 6.4 years in the conservation zone, whereas those in the development zone had stayed for an average of 15.7 years. So this already shows that the development zone is older. People settled there first, which was actually the original design. And for all intents and purposes, we'll call those who are living in the conservation zone as illegal migrants because they are not supposed to be living there. If you look at the number of places that the settlers have lived in the two zones, you find that the average number of places is 2. This is alarming because it gives the impression that those in the conservation zone move around quite a lot. And as they move around, they have the capacity to cut trees and set up new homes, which, as I hinted earlier, would interfere with conservation. Next slide, please. So one of the questions I asked the respondents was if they had intentions to leave. Astoundingly, only 16% of those living in the conservation zone said they intended to move, whereas only 12% of those in the development zone said they wanted to move. So already this presents a problem because you have over 80% of the people saying they do not intend to move. The Department of National Parks and Wildlife, then ZAWA, evicted most of these people, although there's a group which is still there, and they've taken the department to court and they have an injunction and can therefore not be evicted from the development from the conservation zone. So if you look at this graph, those who intend to migrate within the GMA. So people do not want to leave the GMA, and even if they're going to leave their current spot, they intend to move to another area within the GMA, which means there will be no problem being solved here. Next slide, please. So these are just maps to just demonstrate how the land use has changed in the GMA. So on the far east, so the map on top depicts how the situation was in 1990, whereas the one below shows the current situation. This was taken in 2017. So as you can see, the map on top, on the eastern side, that's where the development zone is. And by 1990, we have just a few settlers. The color pink depicts the crop fields. This has changed by 2017 with more pink predominating the development zone. But as you can see, there's an extension of this trend towards the conservation zone. So meaning the conservation zone has not been spared, although it's supposed to be for conservation. Next slide, please. So what did I conclude, or what were my general observations? As a whole, the GMA attracts a lot of migrants, but the conservation zone is attracting more migrants. What could be the reason for this? One of the reasons I thought was population growth. The GMA was designed at a time when the population in the GMA was quite low, but with time, due to natural population growth, the number has increased, but also you find that there are more people coming in, which creates pressure for people to move into the conservation zone. Also, there tends to be low weak enforcement, as Misozi said earlier, and this is primarily because of limited funding, and the GMA is quite large, which makes it difficult to enforce the law, especially in the conservation zone, which is further off from where the council and the district offices are. Also, there's lack of knowledge on the zoning schemes. So what's done in most parts of the world is that the GMA is just a blank buffer with no specific land uses like it's done in Mumbwa GMA. So the aspect of putting different land uses creates an element of confusion because the general notion is that animals and people should live together in harmony, but this is not the case, because people are supposed to occupy a particular part of the zone. Animals are supposed to be in a particular part of the zone. Tourism should take place in another part of the zone, which brings me to the last point. There are also unclear boundaries when it comes to most of these protected areas. So there are no fences, there are no physical boundaries, which makes it difficult for someone from outside, especially, for example, the Tongas who are coming from outside the GMA. It makes it difficult for them to know where the development zone starts or where the conservation zone ends. Next slide, please. So what are some of the policy recommendations one may make? First of all, there should be collaboration among stakeholders. This includes not just the local people, but the chiefs as well as the various government departments which are involved in the GMA. As it is, each department has its own mandate, and some of their mandates are actually not speaking to each other and may be in conflict. For example, the Department of Agriculture would distribute seed and fertilizer so that people can farm. But as they do that, they also extend that help to those who are in the conservation zone and those who end up farming in the conservation zone, which is against what the Department of National Parks and Wildlife advocate for. Also, considering that there's limited resources, there's need to pool resources among these different departments. Rather, as I said, rather than each one of these departments working in isolation, the resources would be put to better use if the departments would work together. Thirdly, there should be an all-inclusive conservation policy that encompasses all aspects of natural resource management in the GMA. As it is, the Department of National Parks will look at the GMA as a place where their wildlife should be left in peace, whereas the Department of Forestry will also be concerned about the habitat that the animals are staying in. While the Department of National Parks may not actually be interested in forests at that level, for them, they just look at it as this is a habitat for our wildlife. The fourth point is also to decentralize and devolve decision-making from the central government and to also involve the local people in the enforcement of the law. As it is right now, the Department of National Parks and Wildlife takes the center stage and they are headquartered in Chilanga, whereas the local government structure, like the municipal councils, have ears on the ground and have more jurisdiction there, but they do not have the capacity to enforce the law, or they do not have the mandate to enforce the law, and will only depend on the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Thanks, Dina, and thank you for keeping to time. Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much, Dina, and thanks for keeping to time. I think we've had some really good overviews so far. Masozi's presentation on the legal system gives us an interesting array at the macro level, what is happening around wildlife management, and Dina's case study, I think, brings it home in terms of the reality of it at the landscape level and in a GMA such as Mumbwa. So thank you, ladies. We're going to shift to the next presenter. Our next presenter is Dr. Dale Lewis, and Dale is the CEO of Comarco, which is the Community Markets for Conservation. Dale has over 35 years of professional experience as a conservation scientist, with his early work focused on elephant conservation in Zambia. During this time, he incorporated such fields as natural resource management, community development, applied agricultural sciences, agribusiness, food processing, and business leadership in the development of what is Comarco today. Comarco pioneers market-based solutions to conservation and rural poverty. Comarco also produces over 12 products under the brand It's Wild, with annual sales of $4 million, all sourced from small-scale farmers with added incentives to protect soils, wildlife, and trees. Today, Dale will be presenting on a market-driven model for linking rural landscape management to protected areas, lessons for Zambia. Dale, welcome, and over to you. Thank you. Alex, could you please unmute Dale? I think maybe that might need some help. Thank you.
Let me see if I can.
Oh, I had to mute him.
Okay. No problem.
Okay, I'm good. So, yeah, my interest in landscape management around protected areas really started with elephants in Luangwa Valley. Over time, it has evolved into a very focused effort to address what I think is a fairly key question that relates to protected area management. And that question is, how do you shape rural livelihoods around protected areas to meet the needs of both people and wildlife? And this is really what I'm going to talk about today. The reason I think this question is relevant is, let me go to my first slide. If you can go to the next slide, please. You know, as we see protected areas in their early stages, it looks something like this schematic. The settlements of villages tend to be stratified with fewer settlements around the protected areas and not very much threat. But as time goes on, the next slide. Next slide. Whoa, you can back up a little bit. I think back up one more, if you can. Okay, doesn't matter. Next slide. Okay. You know, families, due to lack of skills in farming, and in the Luangwa Valley, we're really talking about small-scale farmers. Those are the people that we're really talking about. Often because of lack of markets, maybe family size, too many mouths to feed. Families find the need to move into other areas and extract and look for ways that they can compensate, make up for shortfalls. Again, as time goes on, next slide, the populations begin to build up. And these pressures, again, intensify and are more directed on the protected areas. Next slide. And again, as this continues, we find settlements getting closer and closer to the protected areas, nibbling around the edges with encroachment and extracting biodiversity, often in the form of wildlife. And so it's under threat. And with the next slide, increasing pressures from the towns, the problems can accelerate. The cultural values and norms begin to change as the communities become commercialized. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so I've really briefly sort of highlighted what some of the drivers are and how they influence social and environmental outcomes. And the variable that really manifests itself across these influences, I think more than any other variable, is simply the small-scale farmer. Really trying to understand how that farmer lives in the context that I just described. And it's a dynamic one. So if you're going to try to address this problem, if you do not take a close look at the farmer as a variable, I really don't think you're going to get a good solution to trying to solve these land management problems. And so we have, over the past, I think 17 years now, been developing, refining, modifying, questioning a model that we call COMACO, stands for Community Markets for Conservation. Next slide. So let me just try to define what COMACO is. First of all, it's a little confusing because COMACO is also the name of the company that implements its own model. But of course, we willingly share the model with anyone. But I'm going to be talking about the model. And I think of it as a process of working with small scale farmers across landscapes by linking sustainable eco-agricultural land uses to lucrative value chains through the brand It's Wild and its various products that originate from the same farmers to provide a profitable return from conservation and to provide ongoing incentives for increased conservation outcomes. And it's an iterative process. We don't have an end game. We have a growth strategy of trying to build on this from year to year to year as we strengthen the economic opportunities from conservation. Next slide. I would love to go into more details about really how the model works in terms of its strategies and methods and so forth, but I would like to just share with you instead just three what I would say are key elements or components of the model. And the first one is, I think, really very, very, is your starting point. And the way we've approached this problem is that the first thing that we really look at is how farmers manage their soils. We think everything so much, in fact, depends on the soils because it gives the opportunity for farmers to stay sedentary. And there are various ways, I won't go into this, but if you manage your soils properly, farmers can intensify a sustainable way of growing more food. And by being sedentary, you will begin to see local forests recover or be under less threat. And more opportunities for forest products can develop. And if you do that well, and if you have enough large enough areas of forest, then you might even have a recovery of wildlife. Now, I often say you need to start with farmers and look at the relationships that they have with the soil. That's your starting point. It doesn't always happen that way, and I'm sure there are exceptions, but that's what we think. It certainly is a necessary condition. Next slide, or next click. The next component is, I'd like to talk a little bit about the multiplier effects that markets have on conservation. And we've talked about the agricultural-based products under the brand It's Wild, and over time, as you scale up your number of farmers and increase your volume of farm commodities that you turn into products, your income, based on the vertical axis on the left, over time your total income begins to grow. And at some point, as I said, you begin, next slide. You begin to add, if you're implementing the model, you'll move into forest products. Next slide. And you'll have an opportunity of capturing your market opportunities from carbon. Next slide. And what we have begun to see is that as you enter into the first stage of the Kamako model, your threats to the local resources that you're trying to protect in the land areas that you're trying to manage better, those threats begin to reduce. But when you get into the multiple benefits for markets, there is an inflection point, and you see a stronger drop in threat levels. Next slide. To a point that theoretically you might get to a conservation equilibrium, where you might be able, over a certain span of time, be able to maintain some degree of balance. Next slide. And the third component is, I think, one of the more interesting ones that we've observed, is that by focusing on farming and getting people's food and income levels to livable levels, you find an interesting transformation in the community. People that once would only think about what they're going to put on their plate at the end of the day, they begin to think about the future, and from many different people that you would be surprised, become leaders and become thinkers and become doers and think about their resources. And they have learned really through their soils that it really pays to conserve. And so the communities take on more collective action. Local leaders emerge, and a lot of different things can happen that we've seen that I'd love to go into more detail. But the bottom line is that they are willing to take their own responsibility and self-impose regulations that can protect their resources because they have seen the market value of those resources. Next slide. And the next slide as well. Let me just go a little bit faster, and the next one. I don't know how my time is. So very briefly, in terms of the farming practices, it's agroforestry with a good minimum tillage, and biomass is taken off. It's used for firewood and better yields, and it's I mean, this year as an example, we're planting 47 million tree seedlings of this species that we use for agroforestry. So it's a very big scale now approach all across the Luangwa Valley. And we're getting to some significant numbers. And very briefly, the amount of money that we're returning through our purchases of farm commodities is in excess of about 2.3 million, 2.5 in that range. US dollars, and that's equivalent, if not more, than the amount of money that was coming from wildlife revenues from safari hunting. So the two could be really quite synergistic. Total number of individuals that we're actually buying from is around 40,000, though we're dealing with a much larger number of farmers I'll mention later. Interesting that from eOperate results over the past 3 years, household incomes have been declining in Eastern Province. We pulled out our sample of Kamako farmers, and their income has been fairly stable and increasing levels of food security among our farmers. So we know we're having an impact, and we think we can relate that impact to their thinking and behavior. Next slide. Real briefly, just to show that it is a landscape, or I could even say an ecosystem scale approach. I can't go into a lot of details on how we're structured and how we operate. And I'll just say that we have 5 different manufacturing sites and about 12 or 13 different farmer support centers. But the farmers that we're working with that have signed what we call conservation pledges, it's about 185,000, working with 78 chiefdoms who have created close to 1.5 million hectares of protected forest. That are many of which are currently being managed for carbon. Over 1,700 poachers have surrendered their guns. Look, we've turned the dial back. Still a lot of dangers, a lot of threats, and it's an ongoing sort of maybe you could say a race against time or a tug of war. But if it's a tug of war, I think we're slowly winning. But it is a battle. Next slide. Next slide. This is my last slide, and I hope I don't confuse you or even confuse myself, but it has had a history of very welcomed and appreciated donor support, and I don't deny that. And it's important to recognize that while we are a company, and it's a private company, a nonprofit, I might add, we started off with quite a bit of donor dependency. Where the blue and yellow represent the amount of investments, or I should say grants that contributed to the startup of the company, as well as the figure in the green, that was the amount that was used to support the farmer training and so forth. Over time, I'll simply say that we track our expenditures and how much money and where it comes from very carefully. And we're somewhere in between the last 2 histograms, where we are relying much less on donor money to subsidize the company. We have almost turned that off. We're still dependent on donor money, but I pull out this horizontal line that I call a conservation compliance threshold. And the way I think of it is that you are going to have to spend money. You are going to have to bring value to conservation. Someone's got to provide that value. And if you can hit what that imaginary value is, then the level of conservation compliance is triggered. There is a threshold. You get a really buy-in. And what we're finding now is that with our carbon, we are now pushing us, I think, through that threshold, and we're seeing real change. Next slide. Next slide. And I think at that point, we can feel confident enough to scale the model from Luangwa to a new landscape. And I was very interested in the previous speaker because she's talking about an area that we have just recently in the past year have begun to scale our model into the Mumba and the Teshi area. So as she has already indicated, major challenges there that we're also aware of. And I'll conclude with this slide. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Dale, thank you so much, and thanks for keeping to time. Yeah, so really great lessons there, Dale, and just great to hear about the understanding from the consistent variable of a small-scale farmer. I think it fits in very well from Dina's presentation on the impact that we're seeing and what's being driven on the landscape. And you're learning over time about the behavior and looking at the value aspects and also how to sustain this program are really great lessons. So thank you, and I'm sure there'll be some great questions for you going forward. I would like to introduce our next presenter. Our next presenter is Grant. Grant Simuchimba is a lecturer at the Copperbelt University in the Department of Zoology and Aquatic Studies. His research is focused on the economic impact of protected areas on local communities and the economic leakage of tourism from local areas. He's also interested in the linkages between geographical settlements, natural resource incomes, sorry about that. He's also interested in the linkages between the geographical settlements, natural resource incomes, socioeconomic benefits and costs that are realized by local communities living around these protected areas. Grant will present his topic is economic leakage of tourism from impacts from local areas around national parks, cases of Kafue and South Luangwa National Parks. Welcome, Grant, and I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Sorry, just a moment. I'm just pulling up the presentation here.
No worries. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfectly. Welcome.
Hi, Grant. Yes, we can. We're just working on getting your presentation up. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and apologies for the mishap that happened at the beginning. However, my topic discussion today is economic leakage of tourism impacts from local areas around national parks. So the focus actually was on Kafue and South Luangwa National Park. Next slide, please. Yeah, just to give a bit of background on the study, we're trying to focus on the Kafue National Park, but benchmarking it with the South Luangwa National Park in terms of performance. If you look at Kafue and the South Luangwa National Parks, you see that both national parks actually compete fairly equally in terms of size, number of wildlife which is there. The sizes, of course, the national park is about 2.5 the size of South Luangwa National Park. But the question which, of course, we are asking this study was the impacts that tourism has on the local human communities around the national park, and how much of it is captured by the local communities. So for us to understand, maybe we can understand what we're actually focusing on, which is leakage, the benefits that are actually escaping from the local communities around the national parks. Next slide, please. So when we look at this diagram here, it's actually trying to show us what the impacts are. The income that is coming from the tourists who are visiting the parks actually is spent and distributed into 3 areas. Of course, there's direct effects, which is when the tourists actually are spending their money in the park, in the lodges and the goods and services they're spending their money on. From that, we get the indirect effects, which is the businesses which are doing businesses with the tourism providers. So these are the backward linkages which is taking place. So those are some of the effects which are also taking place. So the other effects is the induced effects. So these actually affects the local communities, the households at the household level. So the workers, the locals who are working within the tourism sector around the parks actually are getting the income and they are spending within the local areas. So those are the induced effects. Now, our focus is on the leakage, but of course the impact is actually the jobs that they get, the direct sales that they get, the personal income, and of course the profits that goes to the operators and the business owners, and the government also would get the taxes from there. So when you look at the last row there, which is looking at the leakage, you see that there are 3 types of leakages. So this is the money, or the money that is escaping the local area as leakage. So there's invisible leakage. This normally actually is the leakage that takes place before the visitor or the tourist comes to the area. So normally it's in the arrangement of transportation or the forex exchange that takes place. So that is very difficult to estimate. But our focus was on the internal leakage and the external leakage. So the internal leakage is the losses or the money that escapes the local region through business, through the actual tourism activities that are going on. So normally most of the services and the goods that have been used there by the tourists are in most cases imported outside the local region. So just to mention there, the local here is actually standing for the areas that is around the GMS and the open areas where the local communities are living. Then the external leakage is actually focusing on the ownership of the businesses that are dealing with tourism. Who are owning them? Are they within the local region or are they coming outside the local region? Next slide, please. So just to give an overview of the methodology that was used, of course, we looked at the number of visitors that are visiting these 2 national parks. So these are the information we got from the park agents, the Department of National Parks. Then we estimated how much the tourists are spending. So we have just focused the spending that takes place within the local regions. So this is the money that they are spending on the goods and the services, and but of course the expenditure outside that area that we did not look at. Then the number of tourism operators which are there, we just looked at the list of how many operators are there, in terms of the campsites, the lodges, all those. We just looked at the list and understood how many there were in each area. Then we now calculated the economic leakage. This we use what is known as the money generation model, which actually will multiply all these factors, including what is known as the multiplier, the economic multipliers. So these will give us the actual multiplier effect that actually is being impacted by the expenditure from the tourists. Next slide, please. So when we look at the results that we have there, briefly, maybe I can just explain on the ownership. So the ownership here, we looked at 3 categories. There's what is known as the total ownership. So this is the ownership that is owned by operators who, in most cases, they own the whole business without any partnership. Then there was what is known as the joint venture ownership, which is actually a partnership in terms of ownership. In most cases, we found that most of the ownership, total ownership, was actually coming from outside the local region. And the locals, who includes the local people within the game management areas and the open area, were only the joint venture ownership, which if we look at the results that we have there, we'll see that the locals owned about 10 to 12% of the activities that goes there in terms of tourism. And the non-local, those who are coming outside the local areas, were about 80, 90% in terms of ownership. So from this and the economic impacts that took place, that we're able to calculate how much leakage was actually taking place from Kafue National Park, and of course from South Luangwa National Park. If you see the internal leakage, which we actually estimated there, it's about 8.5 million, and the external about 1.1. So external, as I mentioned earlier on, it's actually coming from the ownership. Who owns the activity? Who owns the business? Are they from the local areas, or are they coming from outside the local areas? So in terms of percentage, you can see that from Kafue National Park, the money that the tourists are spending within the area, that is being captured by in the local areas, is less than, it's about less than 40%, which is about 34%, and 66% is actually being externalized as leakage. And you can see the comparison with the South Luangwa National Park. You see that in South Luangwa National Park, the leakage is actually much lower, almost about 50% of the money that comes is actually captured, and almost the same amount is actually externalized as leakage. And you can see from the chart that is there, just comparing the 2 national parks, how the leakage actually differs. So meaning that most of the monies that are spent in Kafue National Park, most of it goes back outside the local areas, as you can see from the chart there. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we can see that the tourism economic impact in Kafue National Park is actually about 14.5 million in terms of the money that is spent, the impact, and about 158 jobs are created. And if you see, you compare with the South Luangwa National Park, it's actually much higher, about 50 million, and about 533 jobs are created from the tourism activities. But when you look at the leakage that is going on, it's the other way around. You see that in Kafue it's actually more than what is happening in South Luangwa National Park. So from the external leakage, as I mentioned, is actually contributing about 1.1 million in Kafue National Park. But most of this external leakage is coming from lack of full local ownership. So most of the local people there are not owning businesses to do with tourism as owners. And also there's lack of linkages in terms of the big operators who are there to link with the small entrepreneurs, the locals who are there, so that the benefits can also trickle down to the local people. So that is contributing to the leakages that we are seeing in these 2 national parks. So in terms of recommendation, is that there's need to involve the local people in terms of linkages, involving them in small businesses that actually dealing with tourism, the products that are actually dealing with tourism. And also in terms of policy change, there's need to empower the local people with land, because when they have land, they have a say in the management of wildlife. And when they are able to participate in management of wildlife, meaning that there's that ownership, and the leakage will also be reduced. Next slide. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Grant. That was really good perspectives on the economic side of the protected area impact. And your findings, I think, are very helpful to put it in context in how these two large national parks are performing, and the aspect of ownership as being a driver of what we're seeing as the driving elements of leakage. I'm going to introduce the next presenter, our last and final presenter, and last but not least is Benjamin Waugh. Benjamin is a social innovator and ecological economist, soil scientist, and expert in land regeneration. His work focuses on the biophysical dimensions of economic activity to inform the development of sustainable business, society, and environment. He is co-author of The Economic Growth Engine, How Energy and Work Drive Material Prosperity, with Professor Robert Ayers. He's a visiting faculty at the University of Stellenbosch and founder and CEO of Better World Energy Limited. Benjamin Waugh will present on designing contextual, efficient, and resilient land regeneration systems for mine closure under conditions of extreme uncertainty and resource constraints. Welcome, and I will hand it over to you, Benjamin. Thank you. Alex, would you please help and mute Benjamin?
Am I unmuted now?
You are.
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. This is very nerve-wracking. I'm used to standing up in front of people, but this is the first time I do this. A pleasure to be here, and an honor to be speaking to you about a project that's I'm passionate about. It's a form of action research. I want to place it within the context of the previous presentations, which have been fantastic. We're very much focused on the same end result. We want to reduce land degradation, and what we can see there is urban to rural migration because of a failure to create jobs for urban and peri-urban populations that are burgeoning, and a youth that lacks a future in those areas. So our work is very much focused on trying to generate job opportunities in those regions as a buffer to your activities in the more rural areas. Next slide, please. So a bit of background. The Nchanga mine, KCM, it's been mining for a very long time, one of Zambia's oldest mines, and there is a large legacy of degraded land. In 2015, 2016, KCM approached us to look at a productive solution for land regeneration, using some of the water that they pump out of the mines, significant quantities of this. This interested us because we've been working to develop the option for elite Pongamia pinnata, which produces biodiesel and is able to survive the very harsh conditions at the mine site. And we can look in more detail at that in a minute. So we proposed to demonstrate the potential of our trees. And in 2016, we brought 4,000 elite Pongamia pinnata trees from India. In 2017, the site was opened. We've progressed towards terms of reference for an environmental impact study. And in 2020, we were in discussions with Government of Zambia, ZCCM, and the Environment Fund to move the project forward to the next stage. Next slide, please. So, like I said, Chingola has a long history of mining. The Nchanga mine is particularly complicated. And if you look into the visitor's guidebook, you'll see visitors from all around the world, including the Queen, including the President of South Korea, who complimented Chingola on having built Korea. And when you look at the state of Chingola today, you wonder how we can reclaim some of that glory. Next slide, please. So the present is one of significant environmental degradation. To the upper left, you can see the site from Google, and the town is literally in the middle of all of that. In the middle upper, you can see the main pit. To the right, the town, a bit unfair, that was during roadworks. Lower left, you can see an effort to revegetate, and that was one of 5,000 trees planted on overburden. Only one survived that we could find. Very large tailings dams that have been floor washed to remove most of the sediment and reprocess it, but they never remove everything. Next slide, please. So in the context today, we have over 12,000 hectares of disused, degraded, contaminated land, and this is in Chingola alone. In Zambia, across the copper belt, there's more than 50,000 hectares of such land. There's very little incentive to regenerate, and past attempts have failed. And this is a very important point. At the moment, we're discussing with the ZMerit project, the World Bank funded, whose responsibility is this land, who should pay for it. But these discussions can be made much more easily, and the solution can be found much more easily if the solution to environmental regeneration is profitable. Peri-urban unemployment is very high, education levels are low, mining is in decline, and the post-mining economy is not assured. At the same time, we have an existing economy that requires diesel and puts a burden on forex, and relatively good natural forest cover remains. I mean, it's classified as forest even if it's not there. But there is significant deforestation rates for agriculture and charcoal, and our solution integrates that into it as well. Next slide, please. So the proposed solutions typically come from existing activities in the West, or examples of projects that have been conducted in Europe and then transported to Zambia, typically to encapsulate under topsoil. For 1 hectare, that means 3,200 metric tons for just 20 centimeters, 100 truck trips. 1,000 hectares would need a huge amount, and 100,000 truck journeys would release so much carbon, and chances are there would be deaths with road accidents. Worse, there's not any topsoil available. How would this be stabilized? During the dry season, it blows away. In the wet season, it washes away. You have to use very large amounts of water. And while we have water available at this site, the solution we looked for was to try and assess how drought resilient it could be. And we don't want to use excess water if we don't have to, certainly if it's going to cause water erosion. The other solution that's always proposed is to put native vegetation. And that is typically coming from a Western agenda of putting back some form of an amenity forest. And this is relevant where people have jobs, but if we can create jobs using non-native vegetation where we can't with the native, then this is a solution that we have to look for. In many of these areas, very little of the native vegetation is colonized. Everybody asks about bamboo. It's prolific in the area, but it's never colonized the tailings dams, which are highly saline, highly erodible, and have copper contamination. Then we ask ourselves what businesses can replace the mining, and how can this link to the mines? Next slide, please. I'll have to go fast now. So we require a solution that halts wind and water erosion, phytostabilizes the copper, creates jobs, creates a strong post-mining economy, and in our solution, creates energy for industry and transport and an alternative to domestic charcoal. Next slide, please. Our solution involves a non-native tree. It's called Pongamia pinnata. We've spent a long time working with researchers in India to identify elite varieties which are high yielding. We graft them in India and we import them to the UK, to Zambia. And they have proven capacities for contaminated land tolerance, a very drought tolerance, and critically they produce a non-edible product, an oil, which is not toxic, but it's not edible and tastes horrible. This means that nobody is eating copper contaminated fruit. And unfortunately, mango and avocado are the two plants that do recolonize these tailings dams. Next slide, please. It also produces lots of useful products we'll look at. So we bring the trees in from India. They're taken from science, from small farmers' trees, which they're paid for in India, repacked, acclimatized, brought into Zambia. We spend a lot of time in preparing the pits for the trees and then maintaining the site. And we've had very good success with less than 1% mortality of trees over the 2-year period. Next slide, please. Trees were planted in 2016, integrated with chicken tractors that add fertilizer and microbes into the ground, and a fish pond that we use for fertigation. Next slide, please. Lots of challenges. This stuff is the most horrible stuff you'll ever come across. It erodes and it just moves by itself. It's not really a soil. It's just a terrible sediment. Next slide, please. After 13 months, it's starting to stabilize. Trees are growing well. We're getting a normal pod yield. The pods are low in copper concentration, which means the roots are phytostabilizing and the sediments are stabilized. In the driest months, we're using 20 litres of water per plant per month, and there's wildlife coming in after 13 months. Next slide, please. What we're seeing is incipient islands of new ecosystem creation. And just seeing a diversity that grows between the trees. Now, we have purposefully done nothing in certain areas in between the trees, and some of these areas are recolonizing. And there you can see after 3 years, and this is probably the best area, I have to admit, but it's exemplary, well, it's a good example of how the trees are growing, and then the inter-tree area here is particularly good, but it's a good example of how within 3 years, we've managed to transform this site. Now, the next slide, please. And I'll try and wrap all this up. So, we're trying to replace mining here. And we don't want to just create a biofuel industry. We want to create a biotechnology industry, a land regeneration expertise that matches the expertise that Chingola has and its citizens have always had in mining. You'll note that our leading experts in most of our engineering fields have been trained and come from that region because of the complexity of the mining and because of the complexity of the regeneration story. We're actually leading the world in finding a solution that can generate the revenues and the jobs required to pay for the regeneration process itself. This creates an enormous incentive such that even KCM under the Vedanta ownership were particularly interested. Our stakeholders are the very people that they're unable to employ. Our stakeholders are the people that they find most difficult to engage. And the land we're trying to regenerate is historically their land anyway. So through the creation of these plantations, private sector finance, partnering with environmental regeneration funds, we overcome some of the problems of tree projects. We generate an income through a regeneration service in year 0 that overcomes some of the lead time of the tree to the trees being productive. We have a strong linkage to the mine, as they'll take all of the biodiesel product. The pod shells can replace for charcoal. The pod seed cake can be an organic fodder or can be used as a biogas. And two critical compounds within the oils are biotechnology secrets that can be used for denitrification inhibitors to increase the nitrogen use efficiency of fertilizers, organic fertilizers in farming, because over 30 to 40% is lost. And all of this can be produced locally, processed locally, added value to locally, but also connect very simply to export markets. I thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Benjamin. Thanks for the outside the box thinking and the presentation on regeneration. Lots of good lessons there. And I think even thinking about the link with post mine closure is also a critical aspect of looking at the importance of restoring natural systems and creating livelihoods, but linking it up with mining companies. So I really appreciate your presentation. We're not doing too badly with time. We've got we're 3 minutes into our session. So I'm going to spend the last bit of the hour moderating the questions. What I'll do is I'll ask, there's several questions in the chat, and so I'll try and as much as possible to balance them among the panelists. And Alex, if you're able, it'd be good to get a gallery view of all the panelists. Thank you. So the first question, and to the panelists, I ask that you are succinct in your answer so that we could get more responses and get more questions in. So the first question is for Misozi. So Misozi, on the issue of user rights, private wildlife estate investment is held back by this aspect of user rights. Another major issue is the legislation when it comes to the treatment of wildlife trafficking on private lands. Do you have any recommendations for this, given the new policy clearly advocates for the devolution of user rights and also innovative partnerships and uses? Thank you. Misozi, are you able to speak into the mic? Okay. Whilst we get Misozi organized, I'm gonna, I'll go to the next question for Dale. Dale, so the question is, what methods do you use to promote agroforestry and minimal tillage to small-scale farmers?
Sure, thank you. Agroforestry is a great way for a farmer to save money, and it really replaces the need for expensive inputs. But beyond that, you will get better yields, and it takes only about 2 years to really see that result. So it's a slow startup. We've learned a lot in terms of getting the seedlings to survive. And as many times as we tried to do live plantings, we ended up having really to go the route of nurseries, putting the seeds in plastic sleeves and that route. But what is critical is that when you're planting 47 million of these trees, obviously you can't do that yourself. That's a testimony that the communities are eager to plant them. And the cooperatives, and I didn't mention how important the cooperatives are in organizing our farmers, when I talked about collective action and about doing things that are going to reduce the need for fertilizer, but also ultimately opportunities to put carbon in their soils and get markets from the carbon as well, et cetera, with regard to yields and increases. That local leadership really has been critical for getting those seedlings managed and in the soils and better looked after. Our survivorship is really improved. A lot of lessons there. So we could be helpful in terms of trying to get someone started on what to do and what not to do.
Great, thanks, Dale. The next question I'll hand to Dina. So Dina, the question is, I noticed with sadness that Kafue National Park is being encroached immediately after Mumbwa. Wildlife is being displaced more and more, and I was just wondering who is doing something about the situation. Would you have any comment in terms of your observation with your research and what you're finding? Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things that I observed is that the evictions which were done in the past, when people felt, that is the local people, they felt that they were not really consulted on it. So the Department of National Parks came up with a plan where they evicted people and took them to another area, which the local people felt was not conducive for them. So I think there's need to co-opt the local people, even the migrants, even if they may be living there illegally, there's need to consult them on maybe the best way that they can be relocated, rather than just coming in to forcibly remove them. So the government, the Department of National Parks and Wildlife has tried, I think, on several occasions, but somehow it's not working because of not engaging the local people.
Thanks, Dina. The next question is to Grant. Grant, we have a participant who joined a bit late, so they would like you to help them understand what you mean by leakages.
Okay, thank you so much. Leakages in economic terms, I think it refers to the money or the funds that are diverted from the intended purpose. So basically, if it's in the local areas around the protected areas, you see the money which is meant, or the fund which is meant for the local running of the tourism is actually taken to another area. So the cost will remain in the local area, but the profits and the benefits are going somewhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ms. Ozi, would you be able to respond to the question that was asked earlier? I don't know if she's still able to. Okay. There's several questions for Dale. So Dale, you're on the spotlight for a bit. So the next question, Dale, is do you still see a kind of opportunistic attitude making use or participating in the It's Wild model, while at the same time continuing the practices of poaching, deforestation, and snaring? Tales go around that snares are handed over in return for some cash, but then the next snare is made either to be used or given back again. These are serious threats these serious threats you still encounter? Thank you.
Well, you really have to monitor those threats. Everything has to be very much transparent and honest with what you're trying to change. And we have monitored snares over time. You know, the theory about snares is that it's not a very efficient way to compensate for making for compensating for, say, food shortage or income shortage. A lot of times that we've seen snares were used to obtain a wild animal, obviously illegally, by a family that did not have enough starch or carbohydrate, and they exchanged the meat locally for someone who had a surplus amount of food. It takes a lot of work and time. It detracts you from being a better farmer, for example. So if you are achieving results of food security and income, the theory is by voluntary means, not by law enforcement, but by voluntary means, you'll see a reduction in snaring. And this is what we have seen across much of our area. I'd be happy to go into it, and we published a paper recently on these results. But I am overall very much, again, I mentioned the inflection point with other market opportunities that can come about when the basic challenges of hunger and food security are overcome. And I really do see that, you know, these are not helpless, leaderless people. They are able to really get their feet on the ground, but economic opportunities must be a very important part of that process.
Thanks, Dale. And to the participants, please feel free to, if you have more questions, just plug them in the Q&A and I'll get to them and ask the specific panelist. The next question, I think Dina, you could probably handle this one. So great findings and recommendations in your study. It would be interesting to propose more compatible land uses such as game ranching in GMAs, which ensures biodiversity is maintained and likely less human-wildlife conflict. So Dina, would like to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe just a follow-up. Could you also address the question on, do you agree that your study shows failure to create jobs in existing urban and peri-urban areas, and this is promoting migration to new farming areas within the GMAs as people need alternatives? Maybe you could just touch on those two, the aspect on the game ranching as an alternative and kind of the drivers of why we would be seeing such land use and behaviors from people coming into the GMAs. Dina.
Okay, so the aspect of bringing in game ranching, yes, that would be a good idea. But one of the reasons for having a buffer is to have a transition from the national park into the GMA. So once you bring in the issue of game ranching, that would mean you'd bring in a lot of human-induced activities which would interfere with the natural ecosystem. I don't know if if I've answered that satisfactorily, I don't know. And in terms of having more compatible land uses, I feel the current plan is okay. Maybe the awareness that that should be promoted is how the concept of having multiple land uses within the same GMA should be done. So I think the concept of having multiple land uses is good, but what should be made known to the people involved is how it works. Then on the question from Benjamin, yes, I agree to some extent that the inability to create jobs is contributing, but we must also be alive to the fact that we are an agricultural-based economy. So to really take away the aspect of agriculture from the majority of the people, because that's what they depend on, it would require a more long-term plan rather than something drastic.
Great. Thanks, Dina. Ms. Ozzy, are you able to respond to your question now before I move to Benjamin? Do you want me to repeat it? Alex, I think you might have to mute her. Perfect, okay. Please go ahead. You're good, Ms. Ozzy, you could speak.
Could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. So on the issue of user rights, which you spoke about in your presentation, private wildlife estate investment is held back by these. Another major issue is the legislation when it comes to the treatment of wildlife trafficking on private lands. Do you have any recommendation for this, given the new policy clearly advocates for devolution of user rights and also innovative partnerships and uses?
Thank you. I'll start with the question on how to handle offenses against, like in private wildlife estates, regarding trafficking. I believe there could be an attempt to ensure when it's an offense relating to wildlife, there should be no segregation, whether or not it's on private wildlife estates or on public wildlife estates. Because when you look at the principles of offenses, it's an offense against the state, even if it's committed on private land. So it could be treated similarly. For instance, if someone is trespassing and it's criminal trespass on private land, it's still an offense against the state. Because once the segregation is there, there could be a problem whereby there will be more offenses relating to wildlife on private wildlife estates if there's a difference in the way they are treated. I hope that addresses the question.
The first part. So what about your thoughts on, since the policy is looking at advocating for devolution of user rights and innovative partnerships, how would you think about, how would the policy really think about innovating that if we're looking at even private lands as a land use, or sorry, as a tenure system that's contributing to wildlife conservation?
So what I would say is currently the policy provides for the need to ensure their wildlife user rights. But because of the manner in which the policy, in my study, I identified that the manner in which the policy and the legislation was passed, the act did not accommodate this because the policy came later in 2018. So in addition to the, because mostly what the current act does is that it recognizes the need for communities to participate in wildlife management. But if they organize themselves as local communities, are they going to be given rights to deal with wildlife? For instance, to issue within the wildlife within their jurisdiction, as like when you look at a community partnership park, if it's established, the Act provides for the possibility of ensuring that they enter into agreement with private sector organizations to make it more commercially viable. So now if they don't have those rights, they will have to ensure that they go through the regulator to have access to that wildlife. Whether it's like, it's so much easier if it's what do you call this? If it has nothing to do with hunting. But if it's one of those things where hunting is involved, currently there's no power for them to, they can only participate in the community management. I think that's what I was trying to address. So the actual law, like in the Namibian scenario, needs to recognize these rights. I think that was my submission.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Ozzy. So moving on to Benjamin, there's a question for you. So really great results from your work, and having done an EIS, what are some indications of long-term impacts of the elite Pongamia, the plant you spoke about, coming into Chingola as an alien plant on indigenous plants in the nearby ecosystem? Benjamin, I think, Alex, if you could help and mute him.
Unmute. Am I there?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, very good question. So we've got to the terms of reference stage, which means that ZEMA have agreed to what we have to measure, and we're in the process of generating that data through ongoing observations. So these sites have been completely bare for about 10 years, and very, very little vegetation had recolonized from the grasses or trees, almost none. And this is largely due to the very high salinity. So what the Pongamia planting has done is it's created the conditions whereby local native species can re-enter that site and start doing their job. So in the very short term, well, in the short term, very positive, really. So we're seeing native frogs, you can hear the cicada, you can hear the insects, where before it was just death. And we've also looked at evaluating the self-seeding, and it's very, very low. And then survival of any self-seeded beyond that is almost zero. Now, I should point out that Pongamia can fit very, very well into agricultural agroforestry, as it does in southern India, and actually on a widespread distribution. The critical thing about the tree is its ability to withstand salinity, heavy metals, drought, having a deep taproot, and having a non-edible product. And all of those in combination is very rare. With regards how we address the issue of non-native, our intention is to limit the life of the project, as is standard for most investments. The tree life is normally 50 years. We think under the stressed conditions, it'll be about 35. And the plan then, hopefully, Chingola will be a thriving middle-class town, and it will appreciate an amenity forest, and we'll replant that.
Great. Great, thanks, Benjamin. I'm going to move to Dale. Dale, there's a couple of questions and I'll kind of tag team them. So the first part of the question is, so Dale, this is a good, impactful story, and taking all contextual issues into consideration, in terms of what Kamako has achieved is very impressive. If you were asked to start Kamako again today, what would you do differently? And to tag that on, there's another question that it asks on how can communities in wetlands be involved in such a scheme? So maybe you can respond, Dale, in terms of what you could do differently and thinking about it in a wetland system. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first question is really a good one. It can't really easily be answered, though. There's so many things involved. If you're starting from scratch, what would I do differently? One thing that I wouldn't do differently is I wouldn't stop banging on donors' doors, because donors to get something like this started are critical. This is not the kind of company that your conventional company would even look at. The supply chain costs, your overheads, your startup, everything works against you. And you're a company that's not motivated by the bottom line. You're really motivated for social and environmental change. So it's a quirky kind of business, but it turns out over time, it's really not only a sexy business, but it's marketable. It has strong appeal to consumers. They know they're buying something that's good. It almost sells itself as long as your products are good. Your quality controls must be excellent. We've learned a lot of lessons. If you're going to go into the food business, get those quality controls. Get your team, your CFO, your COO, your extension staff. You just pick the best people and tell them, get prepared to devote at least 10 years of their lives, because it's going to be a long ride. But it's fun, and you will get there, but just don't give up. With regard to Mwapi's question, that's a great one. And I think, Mwapi, one of the things that I would ask is, what are your threats? What are you dealing with? Are you dealing with people that come from outside to poach wildlife? A lot of times you can sort of put a fence around your thinking about Kamako and deal with those immediate threats first. And you have to, as I mentioned earlier, you have to understand the farmer. Most of those poachers are probably just bad farmers. We got a lot of cooperation from the chiefs. It was relatively easy to find out who those poachers were. And of course, over time, we had a business that could support them more and more. Today, we have a Transformed Poachers Association, and they're actually getting established to advocate for their own opportunities in the different market sectors. But to get started, I think you really need to look at what are the threats and think about what are the market opportunities and skills that would be needed to address those threats. Was there another question?
No, that was tagged to it. So thanks, Dale. You able to address it. You actually touched on
Good to hear from Mwapi.
Things. Indeed. So this question's for Dina. And Dina, so there are a few examples of relocation that have succeeded. And from your work, people are not willing to move. Low capacity in local government makes the solution of engaging them difficult. And I see that GMA is not surviving in the next 10 years if this is not addressed. What do you think, and what are your thoughts based on what your findings have come out to show how this could be addressed? Thank you.
Okay, so one of the things I looked at in my study were the land cover changes that had occurred in the last 30 years, based on that map, that those two maps that I showed. Actually, I agree. At this rate, maybe not necessarily in the next 10 years, maybe over a longer period of time, if nothing is done, we might end up with a dysfunctional GMA in that trees are being cut at a very fast rate, people are moving in, and if nothing is done really, we might end up with an isolated national park surrounded by a lot of human-induced activities. In terms of what can be done, of course, relocating people is the first choice. But I think what is key as we relocate people is take them to an area which is best suited to meet everyone's needs. In as much as conservation is the primary purpose, there's also the aspect of livelihoods, and such things should be put as. I've seen another question on, I don't know if I can follow that up.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yes, it's from Johan.
Yes.
It says, do you think it would be possible to address the direct immigration elsewhere? So what's been done in the past is the government finds some piece of land which they feel is suitable, then they send people there. However, the people that I talked to were saying, the GMA in the first place. Is it just about fertile land? No. Mumba GMA is quite central. It connects, I think, 3 or 4 provinces, which makes it easy for the people to sell their produce. So for them, it doesn't make sense to be taken to an area which has a lot of fertile land, but it has no access to markets. So that's one of the points, that people would rather stay in the GMA where they'll have access to markets to sell their produce. So the place where they were sent to was up north, and I think it's quite difficult to get to the place.
Great. Thanks, Dina. Great observations. I've got a question for Benjamin. So Benjamin, deforestation is bringing about the loss of protected land, and the demand for charcoal and firewood from urban areas as well as rural areas is very high. This has increased the levels of deforestation, as we know. The first part of the question is there research being done on this? And then the second part is, in as much as afforestation is being done, I feel we do not find solutions for the problems at hand. And then one day we'll lose our forests. Trees grow at a low rate as opposed to fast rate, which they are being cut at. I would like to hear thoughts on that. Benjamin, do you want to tackle that? Thanks.
I think.
Did we lose him?
Sorry, who is this being directed at?
Benjamin, it's directed at you.
Okay.
Is he there still? Oh, I guess he's not. All right. Then I heard Dale, so I'm going to ask, there's one question for Dale. Give me 1 second. Shoot, I lost it. Yeah, there we go. This is from Joanna from Cornell. So Joanna says, thank you all for your presentations. For Dale, what is the approach to address human-wildlife conflicts around South Luangwa National Park?
Okay, Joanne, that's a great question. We have seen increased problems as we have reduced the incidence of snaring and poaching. Numbers are increasing, and hence conflicts are increasing. And it is going to be a problem, and we can mitigate it to some extent. There are 2 real problems. There's conflicts with the crops, and then actual threats to human life. And it's sad to see that we've had some loss of human life in the recent months. In fact, crop loss can be very tragic for a farmer that has their whole lives tied up with a crop that's going to feed them and give them income for the rest of the year. We use a really important technique. We use chili and use transformed poachers with their guns, literally with their own guns. And they use these guns to blast chili, and it becomes aerosol. and it puts out a cloud at an approaching elephant to a field. And we have done this hundreds, I mean, thousands of times. We've never had an incidence of any accident, but in every case, the elephant turns and runs. Elephants are probably the most destructive, and we think I would venture to guess that we've reduced that threat maybe by 70 or 80%. But we do have the problem of a dangerous animal, whether it's an old lion that's wandered into a community that takes somebody, or a lady was just 2 weeks ago was traveling just not far from her village and encountered an elephant and was trampled to death. And it's just a real tragic event when that happens, and you cannot compensate human life. And so this is, I think, the more we can improve the welfare, it does compensate to some extent. Being very mindful of these risks, maybe more education, but there are real costs, but there should be real benefits to living with wildlife. I think in Zambia, the real benefits of wildlife have not been fully realized, and that's an understatement. I think it could be greatly improved. And I think maybe in the long term, that's how one can be compensated with some sort of insurance that could be subsidized with the revenues from wildlife. But that's just not the case here in Zambia today.
Thanks, Dale. I think I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to close the session. This is one on carbon markets, and Dale, you presented some interesting findings on what you're seeing in that
Sure.
bracket of these carbon markets. So the question is, to what extent are the communities able to participate in the carbon benefits from conserving to sales? Thanks.
Well, it's entirely in their hands, because they're really getting paid for the work that they do to reduce tree clearing. Often that's related to adopting the kind of farming practices that we've talked about, and they have to monitor. They have to keep their own community conservation plans monitored and enforced. It requires a real community commitment, and it's fascinating and to see the change once that first carbon payment is made. The level of interest and enthusiasm to really enforce the regulations that they set for themselves become much more enforced. You can imagine. All we do is simply monitor and help them with the calculations, a lot of technical work for them to be issued the carbon credits, and help them to budget in ways that can enhance the benefits directly to their own needs and to the conservation. But really, it is very much a community-driven process. It starts with a lot of training, orientation. A lot of people don't even know what a carbon is. So there's a startup process. But hey, I mean, people learn quickly. They get it, and I think it's increasingly an important part of rural economy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dale. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, thank you for a very lively discussion, and also just some really great presentations and learnings. I'm going to move to the close of today's session. So I think we've heard some really good findings broadly from the work on the Misozi presented around the challenges around the legal systems in wildlife in Zambia. Part of the aspect on the penalties and how we are structuring penalties around wildlife crime, and how our policies have a lot of gaps around addressing that. So there's that opportunity that I think can help us with, and plugging that from the policy level. But also, I think one telling part is Misozi's finding about how much square kilometer a ranger in our context is covering compared to what the IUCN standard is, how much we're spending in that. And there's clearly a lot of a discrepancy, and there's an underspending. Dina's presentation gave us a really deep dive into a landscape level and what's happening. and really looking at that change over time between the findings from, I think it was 2009 to 2017, and how we're seeing the increase of the land use land cover change in the area being driven around the migrant communities. And also, as we've even heard from our Q&A, how Mumbwa is like a hotspot, and it does attract folks who really want to be able to have access to the market, and it's also degrading the GMA. And also really, we have a fundamental question to ask: if this is what we're seeing in a buffer zone such as Mumbwa, that is part of a buffer of a big ecosystem like Kafui, in 10 years, that question that was asked, are we still going to have that, that GMA in terms of its functionality? So if we look at that map we saw for 2017, what is it going to look like in 10 years? And I think we're at a point where we really need to think about the aspects that we look holistically to address those challenges. And that's why I think moving to Dale's presentation on the innovation that's happened through really understanding the drivers of the threats in the system and focusing on one of the drivers, the small scale farmer, and really designing a model that adds value to the farmer, helps address the land use impacts and the threats, and creates this linkage to the market and grow. And there's a lot of lessons in that, in how really thinking about conservation with farmers at hand, but also users of the land, and how we could bring value to them, but also create these linkages through the markets, growing a business in those landscapes, and the lessons of how this can be done. And it takes a lot of patience. Grant's presentation as well on these two ecosystems and the leakage that's going on in Kafui and South Luangwa, I think also brings some interesting findings on what's driving the leakage. I mean, if we look at the significant amount of income that's coming into the landscape and what actually stays, Kafui, there's a lot of questions that I think we need to unplug in terms of the aspects of ownership. But I think there's also some macro factors and structural factors we need to think about with that. What are the drivers that we actually see in the Kafui landscape? And then think about for South Luangwa as well, what has created those opportunities for ownership that allow for less leakage and more capture. And this goes to the question of tourism. If tourism is a revenue source, we agree that is critical for these landscapes. What are we doing in terms of the policy systems, the innovation, the engagement with the private sector that really helps to unlock our tourism products in these ecosystems? And then finally, Benjamin's presentation on regeneration, I think, brings some interesting outside the box thinking as conservationists, that we need to think about with degraded lands or areas that have been pretty much have been degraded, that mining companies could become partners to restore, but create opportunities for livelihoods, create opportunities for better conservation, soil conservation, and better forest covers. And I think the lesson there is thinking outside the box in how we think about conservation, but also really critical that even as we bring in these new, it might be an external exotic plant, how does this fit in the landscape? Or should we be looking at more indigenous system? And so I think that was a really good last presentation in kind of the thinking outside the box, which I believe we really need to do a lot more of in conservation in Zambia. And there's been some really great lessons learned. As we go forward, I think sessions like this symposium is critical to bring those out. And so my last remarks, I would first of all like to thank all the panelists and the presenters. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your great work and your findings, greatly appreciated. I would like to say thank you to the participants everywhere who joined the call from all over the world. I know we've been on Zoom calls galore for the last few months, but thank you for your time. And finally, I would like to say thank you to USAID and ILRG, Integrated Land and Resource Governance Projects, and my partner, Matt Somerville, and your team for hosting this symposium. And we have another session tomorrow, the same time. And please feel free to join us. We'll have another interesting set of presentations. So have a good rest of your day, and thank you so much.